Hi, and welcome to this segment of Advanced Strategies in Behavior Change, FBA. I'm Candace Southall, and we're going to get started with an introduction to the topic of Functional Behavior Assessment, or FBA. I know you already know all of the basics about FBA. You've had it in previous courses. You had a module on it earlier through the IRIS Center. But what I want to talk about is just a little bit of warm-up before we really get into the details of how to administer the assessments of the FBA. We'll be doing that face-to-face. So here we have some definitions of what an FBA is, a functional behavior assessment, sometimes called functional assessment, but not the same thing as functional analysis. We're going to get to analysis on another day. But functional behavior assessment, or FBA, is a process where we gather information so that we can measure a student's behavior and observe the behavior to identify what antecedents that predict the behavior and what consequences are there that seem to maintain the behavior. We want to know why that student engages in the behavior and what social, affective, environmental, and contextual variables there are to lead to that. The textbook quotes, functional assessment is a process for understanding the context, which is the antecedent and the consequence associated with problem behaviors. So when you think about the information you were getting out of the IRIS module, it gives you a list of steps to take when beginning the process. And here I want you to focus your thinking on providing a behavioral definition of the behavior. Now I know we've been hearing about this week after week, but it's just so very important that we be able to define behavior so that everyone knows when the behavior is occurring. It's not subjective, and we can measure it. So let's quickly go back and talk about behavior once again. I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. But behavior is something that the person does that can be observed, with two or more observers agreeing on the behavior occurring. Now, this is sometimes called inter-observer agreement, and people actually do take simultaneous data to compare the data to make sure that that behavior definition is observable and measurable, that it is clear and concise for every observer. Now, I want to talk about another piece of behavior. So not only should it be defined so that everyone knows when the behavior is occurring and can observe it and measure it in the same way, but we also need to think about behavior in that a feeling is not observable. While following a teacher's direction is observable, behavior does not refer to inner states of the individual, such as aggressiveness or emotional disturbances. Those are not observable behaviors. Covert feelings or states are not observable. For example, yelling at another person or yelling at the teacher is an overt behavior. So this can be observed and measured. So you could measure how long, how intense, or how much Calvin is yelling at this girl. Now, feeling frustrated at a teacher, that is an inner state, and that cannot be defined, observed, or measured easily. Okay, so we want to make sure we're defining behaviors in a way that describes what we see or hear when the behavior occurs. So for example, talking out. Here's a definition of talking out. Out of seat. The child is not supporting his or her weight with the chair. He's up on knees, does not count as out of seat. And attention problems, range of examples. Positive examples and non-examples. Disruption, where child's actions result in consequences that appear to be interrupting other children's work. These behaviors might include noises or physical contact. They may be unintentional or intentional. Now, one of the main reasons why I had you read the Magui article was to check out the definitions that they post in their study. So they listed 4 different behaviors and they have them defined. So negative social interaction is defined here. So that's a very well-developed definition. Off task is the child looks away from the activity or teacher for at least 3 seconds. The child looks away from the activity and does not follow the teacher's direction or a command in 3 seconds. They define tantruming as a child yelling, kicking the floor, or other inanimate objects, pouting or sulking, and it gives examples both of yelling and sulking. Disobeying established rules, any deviation from the rules established by the teacher before the observation. So these are published examples from a peer-reviewed research study. So what are the characteristics of these definitions that make them appropriate definitions? Well, they're observable. They're not indicating inner states. Okay, let's move on and think about beyond providing a behavioral definition for that behavior that you've identified that results in the most missed instructional time, that's been prioritized. You've got your behavior and you've considered other strategies that have been tried that are not working. But we want to also recognize student individual variables. So let's talk about some of the terms associated with this concept. We can talk about altered states. These are specific antecedent events that are either chemically induced or cognitively induced changes within the individual that increases the value of a stimulus or event as a positive reinforcer or a negative reinforcer, meaning they impact the value of getting attention, obtaining preferred activity, obtaining a tangible, or avoiding a task or escaping a situation. So what sort of chemically induced or cognitively induced changes would change that motivation there? A student who has been smoking marijuana is in altered state, meaning perhaps they have a new motivation for obtaining snacks or escaping work or getting to go to sleep. So that's an altered state that changes the student's motivation. You can also think about a student that has test anxiety. So in certain testing situations, a student is more motivated to escape the testing situation. Or a student that has depression may be in an altered state, motivating him or her to behave in such a way that would get them from having to be around other people, escaping certain social situations. So these types of altered states are antecedent events that influence the occurrence of the interfering behavior. And that is also what a motivational operation is, the MOs we've talked about. So it's really a form of affecting the MO. All right, interventions addressing interfering behavior need to address the interactive impacts of these altered states. We cannot overuse the idea of altered states as a way to say, well, there's nothing that can be done. But if a student has test anxiety, then perhaps there are things that could be done to manage the environment so that there is less test anxiety, therefore changing that motivating operation or that antecedent. We also can think about individual variables. We have mediating variables. Those are personal characteristics, sensitivities, internal states that when combined with various events increase the probability of the interfering behavior occurring. Or individual behavior skill deficits also have to be considered, because if a student has a skill deficit in math and you give them a very challenging math work, then that clearly is going to be an antecedent event that could motivate the child to escape the task. So other examples would be delays or impairments in communication. Students that don't have functional communication certainly have a skill deficit that impacts the frequency of behavior that could be interfering. Academic, social, personal, community living that can contribute to the occurrence of the interfering behavior. So we got to think about what are the characteristics that are unique to this student. We'll go through each of these: physical, emotional, cognitive, social, and academic. Okay, so we'll start with physical. Characteristics that are unique to the student can be physical. This could be a physical disability or limitation, medications or the side effects of those medications, impulsivity, or basic needs that go unmet, perhaps inadequate nutrition or insufficient rest. So for emotional characteristics, the students may have a history of emotional trauma. Trauma is when a student has been in a deeply distressing or disturbing experience. And this experience is not processed and causes the student to have ongoing threat response from events and in situations that would otherwise be a usual situation and a non-threatening situation. So essentially, we're looking at defense mechanisms here. Depression and fearfulness, also emotional characteristics that could impact the motivation operation. Cognitive characteristics. So whether a student has limited cognitive ability to understand a situation, to remember previous experiences and outcomes, or high cognitive ability that allows the student to perhaps anticipate outcomes or misinterpret situations. Academic characteristics need to be considered. Is the student in an environment where this learning preference is in conflict with how the teacher instructs? Is there inadequate prerequisites for the student to engage in the task at hand? There could be academic frustration that acts as a individual variable. But sudden academic difficulty is a clue that there is a need for assessing the behavioral components of the interfering behavior. Now, for social characteristics, we also have to consider peer pressure as a motivating operation. Does a student feel like there is a certain perception? Does the student engage in behavior simply because they feel like there is a social pressure to be quote-unquote cool, to be a quote-unquote bad boy or bad girl? Or is there a social pressure to appear to fit in with a certain group? Therefore, a student behaves to avoid disappointment. So avoiding peer disappointment or peer disgrace. Cultural differences, as we've already discussed, could impact the student behavior in that maybe it's a behavior that is reinforced in other environments, but not in the classroom or in this specific classroom. And also we have to consider family influence. So anytime you can bring in the family perspective is going to help you understand the motivations of the student. One other thing I would like to mention is a response class. So if a response is actually another term for the behavior, and we've already discussed that in this course, but so they call it a response class as a behavioral term. But sometimes behaviors of varying topographies or behaviors that look different, they have similar functional antecedents and consequences. For example, hitting, kicking, slapping, and biting of others, while all have different topographies, may be influenced by the same factors. They may be occasioned by the same antecedent conditions, that SD, that indicates that the consequence needs to be obtained or avoided. All right, so then we have a response class hierarchy. This is behaviors that are members of the same response class, but they incur in a predictable behavior chain, meaning that low intensity behaviors might escalate into more intense behavior. So perhaps a student who bangs on his desk as a first behavior and then knocks the desk over as a second behavior and then throws a chair across the room as the third behavior. These are all part of the same response class, meaning they have the same antecedents and consequences, but they occur in a predictable manner in a predictable chain. So you can address that whole behavior or response class with your one intervention. And again, I just want to remind you of the matching law. As we move forward and we think about students will behave in a way with the rate of responding or behavior is proportionate to the rate of the reinforcement. So sometimes students have they might find a good grade and praise reinforcing, but maybe getting out to be with friends is more reinforcing for the amount of work that's being asked for to get some praise. So we need to think about what we're giving a student as a response to the behavior we're asking them to do and what other reinforcement they may be giving up. We also need to think about the timing of the reinforcement, meaning if it's delayed, and then just overall quality of the reinforcement compared to the effort that they have to put in. Now, lastly, I just want to talk about the 6 primary outcomes of the functional assessment. How do we identify the interfering behavior? Through this functional assessment, we can get a clear description of interfering behaviors, including the classes or sequences of behaviors that occur frequently together. There I am. Okay, and now we need to use our FBA to identify the immediate antecedents that predict that the interfering behavior will or will not occur. Remember, those discriminative stimuli have to be paired with a S delta, a stimulus delta, meaning so only in certain occasions is the reinforcement available, but there have to be occasions when the reinforcer is not available. If you remember, when the student holds out the card, the communication card for a spoon, when someone's in the room, they get a spoon. If they held out a card to ask for a spoon when no one else is in the room, they would never get the spoon. So we need to be able to identify what are the stimuli as well as the setting events or the motivating operations. But antecedents predict the behavior occurrence or non-occurrence. So a student walks into class and first thing makes a loud noise to get attention, and the paraprofessional says, well, good morning. Now remember not to yell. We have to be able to identify these certain antecedents or discriminative stimuli, where the SD here is the paraprofessional who signals to the student, hey, if I yell, she's going to notice me and say something to me. So those are the kind of things we'll be looking for. All right, and then we have identifying the setting events, times, and situations that predict when the interfering behavior will and will not occur. So setting events and situations that predict the interfering behavior create and abolish those motivating operations. The student is hungry mid-morning, so food is a reinforcer. It's the day after Halloween, so candy, not a reinforcer. Maybe previously it would have been. Maybe a student is tired after lunch, so escaping work would be a reinforcer at that time. Or if they're given a difficult task, that makes avoidance of following teacher directions a more potent reinforcer than a good grade or praise. We are going to identify the consequences that maintain the interfering behavior. So what functions as a reinforcer for that behavior? Remember, we're looking for avoidance, escape, or attention, or perhaps obtaining a preferred item or desired activity. Number 5 is developing one or more summary statements or hypotheses that describe the specific behaviors, specific type of situation which they occur, the outcomes or reinforcing or maintaining those. So when Sam enters Sam's Club, he emits a loud noise in order to escape the smell in Sam's Club. So there's my example. And then lastly, we have a collection of direct observation data that support that summary statements that have been developed. So when we're having our full instruction on collecting data for FBA, then you have this background information now to support getting in deep and what we're going to pull out of that information. I look forward to our next meeting, and I appreciate your attention. Have a good day.